What was it like growing up in your household?
Right. So I was an only child, and I did grow up in a Christian home. Both of my parents, they're still together. They're still married. Just great, loving family, great childhood. When I turned, let's say 15, I guess somewhere 14 or 15, things began to take a little bit of a turn for me. So up until that point, I had been raised in church, and my family, they were of the mindset of, if the door of the church is open, we're there. Like nothing's going to get in the way of us being there. We were there Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesdays. It was ingrained in me that God was supposed to be first. And so around the age of 14, 15, 16, I think all of us kind of come to this point to where we're like, okay, I want to be more of my own person. Who am I? And unfortunately for me, I began to hang out with the wrong people and the wrong friends. And I began to make just some very unwise choices, and just began this downward spiral of walking away from my faith, walking away from all that had been instilled in me as a child. And, I'm talking like drugs and partying and just all of these things that were completely opposite of who I was up until that point. And at that time, I could see and sense even just the pain and the struggles that my parents were dealing with in the midst of the choices that I was making. But as many teenagers, was very selfish, and it was all about me and what made me happy and what I wanted to do. And I remember the turning point was at the age of 16, when, as an only child, I had to sit in front of my parents and tell them that their only child was expecting her own child, that I was pregnant at the age of 16. And I remember just the whole family being there in tears. And it was a scary thing. It was very scary in many ways. I mean, just the initial having to announce this to my parents, and how are they going to receive this? And so I had actually gone to my youth pastor at the time and had shared it with them first, and was like, hey, will you guys sit in with me on this conversation with my parents? So he and his wife were there present with us. And of course they said, okay, we're going to sit there with you, but you're going to be the one to tell your parents this. This needs to come from you. But we're going to be there to kind of talk you guys through this and walk you through it. And so they were there with us for that initial conversation. And again, I remember just the tears and the pain and just the disappointment in their faces. And I think what was the worst part was that my father himself said absolutely nothing.
Really?
He said absolutely nothing. My mom is kind of having this conversation. And I remember the youth pastor asking my father, like, well, you haven't really said anything. What is on your mind right now? And the only thing he said was, this was to be expected. And it was like a knife to the heart, like, oh gosh, which I deserved, of course, because of the choices that I was making, the lifestyle that I was living. So there was some struggles, obviously, being a young teenager that was now pregnant. And one of the very first thoughts I had was, okay, for every decision that I make from this point forward no longer just affects me. It's going to affect my child as well. And I decided, you know what, as hard as I ran away from God, I'm going to run towards God, and I'm going to run after God. And so, I had that conversation with God, and, I asked for his forgiveness, and I asked for his help and his strength, because I knew it wasn't going to be easy. But I didn't know how difficult that was going to be. And so, as you can imagine, somebody who has, in a way, walked away from a good core group of Christian friends, to be with friends that were the exact opposite and living in the world and making a lot of difficult choices, I had to make the choice that, okay, I've got to walk away from these friends that I've made, or the people that I consider to be my friends who have been the bad influence. And I've got to get back to the people that are going to help me and are going to encourage me to move in the right direction. That wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. And I remember the first Sunday back in church, I remember so vividly going and sitting down and with, the youth group had like this certain area that they all sat in the section. And I remember going and sitting down and thinking, okay, I'm back. I'm doing this. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to move towards God. And, I'm doing this for myself and for my child. And I sit down, and some of my other friends had come and they had sat down around me. And one of them came and sat down, and I just happened to look over the direction they were looking. They were looking at their parent that was sitting across the room, and their parents looking at them, shaking their head.
Oh, my.
Like, don't sit with her. Don't sit next to her. You're not, And that was the beginning of what I found to be a very difficult season that I had to walk through of, okay, I've made the decision that I am going to be the person that God's called me to be. I'm going to be a different person. But finding those people that were still going to be there for me, the people that still wanted to be my friend despite the fact of, that I had made mistakes or I had made bad choices. So that was a difficult season to walk through, for sure.
Like, and as a teenager, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes here, feeling like church was your home at one point. And now that home is almost being stripped away by the very people that said that they love you. Mm-hmm. How did that feel, when you were going through that? And who were you able to rely on at that point to kind of keep you stable and grounded?
Right. So many times it felt very alone. My parents were there for me. I was able to rely on my parents. But there was always this sense of guilt or shame or embarrassment, I guess I would say. So I knew my parents were there for me, but the relationship just felt different. I mean, it was probably more me than it was them in a way. So I knew my parents were there for me. There were some leaders in the church that were there for me. There were a few friends that were there for me. But what I really had to do at that point was lean into God. Before I walked away and started making these bad choices, I had a solid relationship with God. There were times that I really sensed His voice. I sensed Him speaking to me. I was called into ministry at the altar at the age of 14. I sensed Him speak to my heart. So I knew God was real. And so I had to go back to that place in my mind and in my heart that, even though people may fail me, God never will. God never has. Even though I feel shame and embarrassment when I'm around these people, I don't feel that when I'm with God. I don't feel that when I'm talking to God. I feel the love and the compassion that draws me in, that keeps me saying, okay, I'm not going to go back to where I was, that I need to keep pressing forward, no matter how frustrating it may seem, no matter how hurt I may feel by people that I thought were there for me, people that I thought were friends or thought that were my core group. God's not going to fail me. He was a constant in my life. And so that was what kept me on that path of following Him and trusting Him, because when I would go in and talk to Him and be in His presence, I just sensed nothing but love and acceptance from Him. And that was something that I didn't get everywhere else.
That makes sense, man. Mm-hmm. So fast forward a little bit, you give birth to your son. Mm-hmm. What's going through your mind in that moment? And who was there to kind of help you along with finances or housing? Like, did you end up going back to living with your parents? Like, how did that work for you?
Yes. So I stayed with my parents for the first year. Austin was born when I was 17. And so Austin's father, Chris, who I'm now married to, we actually ended up getting married a year later when I turned 18. And we're still together. It's been 25 years.
Congratulations.
And yeah, thank you. And so, so my parents were there for me. My husband was there for me. It was a short period of time, but seemed like a long journey. As you can imagine, there's a lot of maturing that you have to do from, a teenager to all of a sudden having to step into the role of a mom. a mom and a wife and an
Yeah.
adult. So I'm sure I messed up a whole lot. I'm sure there was a lot of mistakes that I made. I can guarantee it.
Chris, don't you dare say anything.
Yeah, don't point that out. But yeah, it was a difficult season, but it was a growing season for me.